started exploring Africa, they found villages with 250,000 people. Okay, with no diseases. Okay, London had a cholera epidemic, which cholera basically comes from sanitation, where your poop gets in your drinking water and you get sick. In the 19th century, besides all the plagues and all that other kind of stuff. Which is not to say Africa's disease-free. There's lots of hot viruses originating there. But again, so before the pyramids and before cities, building infrastructure beyond the natural environment, every adult, that means 13 years plus, had a voice in the government without restriction. So in their idea of democracy, and demo is actually a Comedian word, which means the people. And the reason we associate democracy with Greek is because there's been a language study done. There's on the book list, Martin Bernal, who is a Jewish linguist. And he basically wrote a series of books, one of which is called Black Athena. And so Bernal's thesis is this: 80% of the Greek language is composed of either Egyptian or Phoenician. 80%. Only 20% of the Greek language is indigenous, ancient Greek. Yeah? Phoenicians were kind of like the merchant fleet of Egypt, even though they had their own country. So for example, Hannibal of Carthage was Phoenician. Okay? So Bernal says that Phoenician has a one-to-one correspondence with Hebrew. It's Hebrew. It's a variation or dialect of Hebrew. And he's Jewish, right? So he's basically saying, look, we have two models of the ancient Greeks. We have the ancient model, which is the Greeks themselves, basically saying that we went to school with black Africans because they have their universities. So they're going to Egypt and they're studying for 30 years and then they come back and they're trying to spread, the technology that they learned there. And that's what Herodotus, the Greek historian, is saying. But there's some folks that didn't like that, and Bernal talks about the Aryan model. Now, the word Arya itself is a Sanskrit word, which means pure in spirit. Someone is Arya, they selfless service, pure in spirit. Some German scholars took that word and decided that Aryans were a race of white people who swept down from the Khyber Pass, conquered all of India, civilized all of India, and disappeared without leaving a trace of their existence. Because when they come to India, they see all these buildings and temples and think, oh, you guys couldn't have done this. You're black people. We're the superior white race. So the idea, this is coming out of German university, coming with this theory of the Aryan model. And so they're basically saying that their model of Greece is that the Greeks pulled themselves up by their sandal straps, not bootstraps, and created civilization on their own. Which is not what the Greeks themselves said. But these Aryans, or Germans, are saying that. So here's where Western civilization canon comes from. German universities developing this in the 18th century. The German university system gets transported over to England because the House of Hanover, George I, II, and III, from Hanover, Germany, are ruling England. German university system becomes the English university system, which becomes the American university system with the same curriculum. Western civilization, boom. So when you study Western Civ, you know, if you take, you know, the classes here that are offered in Western civilization, they will show you a timeline where that is.
Is the Hanover?
The House of Hanover. Georges 1, 2, and 3. George 3 is who we fought the Revolutionary War against. All right, so obviously, you know, the German scholars basically are saying, well, we discovered democracy, and our democracy is the only model democracy that we know, whether or not they are aware that there are, you know, I mean, they can read the Greek scholars themselves. Oh, well, they don't know what they're talking about. So, indigenous democracy, insofar as quote-unquote evidence exists. So again, here's what the evidence would be. The native cultures that had writing and had codexes and codices, those writings were destroyed by the Spanish. Others who had, you know, oral traditions. Well, can you trust story, even if it's handed down by generation? I mean, the Bible was stories before it was written down in Scripture for thousands of years. These people may or may not have had writing. Right? So, indigenous democracy, insofar as evidence indicates. So I'm going to say as late as 1100, and that's the formation of the Iroquois Confederacy or Iroquois Six Nations, who basically, in their form of democracy, was referred to as the White Roots of Peace. That is, the sacred white pine. So they're people of the longhouse. And the longhouse was made out of white pines, white pine trees. So, probably before 1100, given the evidence of cities, for example, notice the bias, so I'm telling you, you know, in our language, a citizen lives in a city. Civilization is building of cities. Right? So, indigenous democracy, every human being present, as well as unborn children and ancestors and the natural and visible world, influence the government. So the phrase, all my relations, basically represents that idea, or quattro unit of logic, as Edwin Nichols would tell us. So you can see the comparative logics of the phrase, we the people, is not the same thing as all my relations. Because we the people, well, who's a person? They're talking about themselves. They're not talking about every human being present.
It's dividing them up.
Yeah. You know, basic divide and conquer. All my relations is not just human beings, it's all sentient beings, which is represented by things that Western civilization doesn't even consider a being. Who cares what the trees think? They can't run away. So, politics itself is the science of power. Who has it? Who has it not? Who loses it? Who gains it? Who gets to define it? And who makes the rules? It's not as simple as the golden rule. I'm not referring to the biblical golden rule. I'm referring to them that's got the goal makes the rules. Okay? Not that simple. But who has power? And who doesn't? Power environments are created. They're artificial. They're constructed. You have to build them into the language. So, which is why, for example, why is it that gold mine, if there's a golden rule, why is it that gold miners don't make the rules? And why are the mine owners making the rules and the mine owners aren't the ones in the mine getting the gold? Authoritarianism, but I point your attention to one of the current situations in South Africa. Okay, where the police are shooting miners just like they were doing in the 70s under apartheid. if you stick around for a third term, we'll talk about comparing the constitutions between the United States and the new South Africa. So the Bill of Rights in the new South Africa, I mean, it's almost like it was written in, well, what Eugene would like to think it is. Okay, no discrimination on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation, disability, religion, 11 official languages, state support for 16 additional languages, etc., etc., etc. Here's the problem. Great Constitution, great Bill of Rights, better than our Bill of Rights. They don't have the money to pull it off because the gold and the diamonds are in the hands of multinationals, not the people of South Africa. That's why gold miners don't make the rules. If they don't own the mine. Oh, that's socialist. No, this is like fair compensation. Okay? People who mine or extract a valuable resource and put their lives at risk should actually be getting the lion's share of that resource. It's my opinion. Wade Nobles once said, so Wade Nobles is an African-American psychologist and Afrocentric researcher, scholar, historian. You can Google him. He's got some great videos on YouTube. He once said, power is the ability to define reality so that others respond to your definition as if it were their own. Power is the ability to define reality so that others respond to your definition as if it were their own. So this works in a couple of ways. Empowerment or domination. Now when Wade introduced this, when I heard him in the late 80s, early 90s, he introduced it in a domination way, and I'm just going to flip that script and introduce the empowerment way first. So, there's two kinds of power in that framework. Power with and power over. So in empowerment, literally translating that word into English and breaking it in, EM means within. Power is the capacity to be effective. Ment is mind. So power within mind. Power within mind. So I affirm the power within myself and within you. Neither of us is diminished. Okay? As a drug counselor, when somebody comes into me and they're in the shakes with heroin, I say, I see the clean and sober person that is emerging within you that is going to emerge from this pain and suffering. In fact, you have to go through the pain and suffering to become stronger. You know, that's kind of that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger thing. Okay? It's your withdrawal and you're going through that whole process, you only wish you would die. It won't kill you. But if you go through it, you come out the other side, and I'm going to affirm that strong person within you. Okay? Now, what does that mean? Do I have power over them? No. But I'm saying, letting them know, I know there's a power within me, and there's that same power within you. I'm affirming it.
Helping someone to flower.
Right. But the power is always within them. You're just affirming that it exists. You didn't put it there. You just have, each of us has a choice to affirm it or not. And then people try and put you down. So you can either accept what they do or not. So that's the other kind. Empowerment, power within mind. I affirm you. Neither of us is diminished. Power, okay. So this course actually takes its name from a quote from Wade. And he's talking about black people in America. He's saying, we're not up from slavery, basically referencing Booker T. Washington. We're down from the pyramids. Okay, taking out of the slavery question. Okay, America didn't exalt us, it diminished us. We have to get back to where we were. So, domination. I advantage myself to have power over you, particularly where you are more powerful than I. So, I psych you out, get inside your head. For example, in gang culture, respect and power comes from the fear of potential or actual violence or structured systemic violence. Remember watching the movie Grand Canyon, Danny Glover? And he's confronting the young gang member because Kevin Kline got lost coming from a Lakers basketball game, and he's wandering around in the hood in Inglewood rather than going to Westwood, and his car breaks down, and these gang members want to jack him, and he calls AAA. Danny Glover is the tow truck driver, and he shows up and starts hooking up the car, and the leader says, "What are you doing?" And he says, Am I talking to the right person? No, we're all together. Am I talking to the right person? Yeah, you are. So, the way it's supposed to work is I'm supposed to hook up this guy's car, and you're supposed to let me drive away. I shouldn't have to ask you to do that. And the young brother says, so you're having to ask, so you acknowledge that the gun is giving me respect. So I'm just asking you, where is the respect without the gun? And Danny says, you don't have a gun, we aren't having this conversation. Oh, so power does come from the gun. Well, if you want to believe that, sure. But guess what? Some people have bigger guns than you. So is that where power comes from? A gun? Only fear. Right? So people do, so power and respect in one meme, where the idea is power is domination, the fear of potential violence or systemic or structural violence. As Wade put it, he basically introducing this concept. So he said, take Columbus. Columbus basically said to the Indians, I don't know who you are, but you Indians now. Okay? And then a whole set of laws and policies and structure come from that statement. The doctrine of discovery and all the other things that we've talked about earlier. So in the power of definition, all science in any culture is the collection of facts and truths verified through replication. Science reflects the axiology of the culture that created it. Now I will do a whole sidebar on what axiology is, but literally it's a branch of philosophy and metaphysics which the suffix ology literally means study of. Okay? Axi, if you look at the English words that have axi as a prefix, so you have axis, axle, right? So in psychological and metaphysical and philosophical terms, an axiom is something that we hold to be true without proof, or values in psychology, your values. So do you question your values, or do you hold them, these values are something you hold to be true without proof?
The prejudices and assumptions that we make determine our results.
Right, which is also a result of values. Okay, and we don't necessarily always examine those, even though you might remember in the 60s and 70s going through values clarification exercises in school. What do you believe? What do your parents believe? Well, go to church every Sunday and don't steal and the 10 Commandments and all that kind of stuff. Do you question it? Well, no. That's the way you're supposed to be. So, science reflects the axiology of the culture that generated it. Now, what we talk about in English is empirical science. Empirical comes from the empire. That would be the Roman Empire, in which we only believe in things that we can actually touch and measure. Okay? If you can't measure it, it don't exist, or it's not relevant within that science. Right? Empirical science. Not only do we touch it and measure it, but we also have to be able to replicate the experimental result. That's in Western science. Right? So if we take, for example, anthropology. So Western anthropology focuses on the study of culture through artifacts, objects, archaeology, and the etic. So within anthropology, there's etic and emic sources of belief. So the etic point of view, which is outside of the culture, study of culture, the beliefs. We observe that these people are doing that, and they have these objects, and they make up these stories about them, and we analyze it from a quote-unquote objective point of view. That is outside the culture, because if you're inside the culture, you're biased. All right? So an emic point of view is the study of culture from within the culture. Like emotion, emic, within. Okay? Just like that prefix. So Western anthropology, of course, until postmodernism, that is after World War II, did not study itself. In other words, Western civilization. Okay? It was the culture, the science that studied other cultures. So for example, if you were Native American and you wanted to study, for example, Eugene Skinner's skeleton, you couldn't do it. Right? But how come Western anthropologists can study Native American skeletons?
Legalize looting.
Oh, it's science. It's not a crime, it's science. It's for the good of us all. So notice that position. We can dig up your folks' graveyards and study them, but you can't dig up ours.
Wait, what?
Wait, what? Yeah, right.
Wait, that's like a law? Or?
That's the study of anthropology. Anthropologists go around digging up indigenous people's bones for study, but even if you got trained as an indigenous person, you could not go dig up the settlers' bones from a pioneer cemetery and study them.
It's illegal.
Oh, that's grave rob. But wait, if a Native American grave is not as unequal to a pioneer's grave, where do we get that? Well, I'm saying, okay, so yeah, that is the law until, again, Native American community activism got laws like NAGPRA and said, okay, you will make an effort if you find bones somewhere to repatriate them with the nearest tribe. Okay? You can study them for an appropriate time, whatever that is, but you will they'll give them to the nearest tribe to bury them. So, for example, Kennewick Man. There is no theory within Western civilization that says that there were white people here 10,000 years ago. Right? And Kennewick Man, they found this skeleton, on the Columbia River, and they dug it up. And so Native Americans said, well, if you dated it back to the time that you dated it, it's ours. It's one of us. So there was this whole fight. There's this whole battle of, well, no, the anthropologists want to study. No, look, yeah, you can study it, but, you can't be keeping, there used to be hundreds, if not thousands, of skeletons in the Smithsonian from Native American graves. Stored in boxes. Right? Now, again, we look at whose point of view, who gets to study who. Now, Native American anthropologists are not interested in studying pioneer bones, but I'm saying turnabout is fair play. So it's just this particular point of view that says, oh, we can study you, but you can't study us, and we don't study us.
It's also like
We learn about humanity by studying you. Well, what? Take a look at yourself.
Like there's U.S. military bases all over the world, but there's no Cuban military bases here in the U.S. There's
Right.
no Japanese military bases here.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Power. So, like, for example, Lucia. So scientists' reconstruction of her. So basically, found Lucia, found in Brazil more than 10,000 years ago, before Columbus, honored the black woman. This came from a site, came over, actually FB, from his brother in LA, Ronoko Rashidi. Global African, he has a bunch of pictures, and Lucia is one of them, reflecting the spread of African people, designated to Joel Augustus Rogers. J.A. Rogers was a amateur, and what I mean by amateur is not that his technique wasn't good. He was not connected to a university. So he's an amateur historian. And here's what his thing was. He came up in the 30s and 40s, and I actually have some of his original books where, you know, my grandfather gave me these books and raised me on them, and they're, this was in the, in the 30s and 40s with the rise of Hitler and all these other folks. There, people were concerned about race mixing, quote unquote, race mixing. Okay? Particularly black-white race mixing. And Rogers basically, you know, he married a Scandinavian woman. And he spoke German. So he goes over to Europe into all these family history books and finds all these coats of arms with what we call in our vernacular Afro-Europeans. Black royalty of African and European descent. Mixed race people. And he goes back in the history, goes back to Greek, and he finds out this has been going on for like 1,000 years, and the Greeks and the Romans didn't trip. They're fully fledged members of our society. Wouldn't even trip about that. In fact, you know, some people actually want to mix with black people because they feel it improves the breed. Like there's a whole thing in samurai, you know, to be a good samurai, you have to have a little black blood. Not making that up. And when you look at the examples of Alexander Dumas, which, you know, you think the Three Musketeers? Well, no, it's not just the Three Musketeers. He's the son of a black general and a white French woman. And his father was Haitian and a French nobleman. And his father was a 4-star general in Napoleon's armies, who got dissed by Napoleon, who, you know, I mean, this guy was bad. He was like a superhero. He was in a battle and held off the attacking army single-handedly, holding a bridge while wounded by sword, until reinforcements came an hour later. So Dumas wrote about him. And his father was locked up in prison, and that was the real-life model for the Count of Monte Cristo. His father's swordsmanship was the model for D'Artagnan in the Three Musketeers. He was actually invited by a U.S. senator to come to Virginia, and he politely declined because he says, if I'm a black man coming to Virginia, no matter where I come from, the laws in Virginia say I could be made into a slave. Thanks, but no thanks. Dumas. Pushkin, the Russian poet. Beethoven. Okay? Beethoven's biographers, written by people who were there with him, describe him as a mulatto. Mulatto. There is only one use of the word mulatto in the English language. First generation black-white mix. I mean, these are from people who lived with him. Now, Joel is citing this and a picture of Beethoven as well as a life mask of Beethoven with a nose like mine. Not with wavy hair, with hair like mine. That is displayed in the cast. Now, here's the challenge with using Rogers' books. All the books that he cites, writing in the 40s and 30s are out of print now. Right? So I even looked at a kiddie biography of Beethoven written by, published by Scribner's in 1976, which described Beethoven as swarthy. Swarthy, like excellent suntan. Germany is not a tanning destination. And there's other people we'll talk about when we get to that time period of Afro-Europeans. A Queen of England. George III's wife, Charlotte Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She was called by a British biography the monkey-faced little princess. Monkey. Because she was beautiful, so you don't usually describe women in sexist term by you calling them a monkey. You usually say dog or something, right? So monkey, where do Europeans think that monkeys come from? Africa. And her own physician described her as classic mulatto features. Okay, now even though she's sitting on the throne of England, people are still dissing her because of her race, but some people also love her. Mozart composed stuff for her. There's a Bach that composed stuff for her. There's a flower named after her. Several counties. Okay. Charlotte, North Carolina, in Mecklenburg County. Charlotte Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Now she never set foot here. Afro-European. So Rogers is basically talking about this in his books with extensive documentation. So for example, we'll get into this. I'm sorry to. Do you mind? Okay. Sprechen Sie Deutsch?
Nein.
Nein?
Guten Tag.
Schwarz in German means black. Okay? So Rogers has a book, and I'll show you the book at some point, where you look at family names and you look at the family crests. So you have Schwartzman, black man, Schwarzkopf, black head, Storm and Norman, Schwarzenegger, a Negar is a person from Niger or Africa. Actually, in the 90s, I saw Arnold on Letterman, and Letterman asked him what's the meaning of his name, and he says he's a black plowman. Schwarzenegger literally means in German black and from Africa. Now I know people are conditioned by the Western canon to think of Europe as wholly white, but understand that all these countries, Germany, France, Belgium, Holland, etc., were multiracial societies. Okay, but that fact is hidden. But it is a fact. So, Lucia, named for the skeleton of a Paleo-Indian. Now, notice that terminology. She's not black because in our current configuration, we don't believe that black Africans came to the Americas before the Indians, so that's why she's called a Paleo-Indian. I'm going to actually move through this without necessarily lecturing on it, but it'll be up on the website in a day or so. But she was found in a rock shelter by a joint French-Brazilian expedition that was working not far from Belo Horizonte in Brazil. The remains were not articulated. That means they weren't together. It wasn't an intact skeleton. The skull, which was separated from the rest of the skeleton but was in surprisingly good condition, was buried under more than 40 feet of mineral deposits. and debris. There were no other human remains on the site. She appeared to have died alone, but more than 40 other skeletons from the same general period have been found in a nearby area called Lagoa Santa. New datings of the bones have determined that Lucia is one of the most ancient American human skeletons ever discovered. Forensics have determined that she died in her early 20s. Although flint tools were found nearby, hers are the only human remains in the cave. Facial features include a narrow oval cranium. Anthropologists have variously described her features as resembling those of Africans, indigenous Australians, Melanesians, and the Negritos of Southeast Asia. Walter Neves, an anthropologist at the University of Sao Paulo, suggests that Lucia's features most strongly resemble those of Australian Aboriginal people. So he basically thinks that she must have come over, not on the land bridge of Siberia, but somewhere else, small watercraft, before or during the last ice age. All right. So, diunital logic, the union of opposites. Also, the simplification of complexities, and also being able to see complexities in the simple. There is a black gay science fiction writer, Samuel Delany, who wrote a small novella called Empire Star, which basically describes a stellar empire based around a particular star that has multiple stars revolving around a common gravitational center, which stretches time-space so that you could enter on Wednesday in this year and arrive 150 years on Tuesday. So once you can do that, you can basically change the timeline that you're in to keep yourself in power. All right? So there has been a war. I mean, the book is one of my favorites in terms of describing things, but one of the concepts that he throws out of there, and these are actual English words, are simplex, complex, multiplex. So if we're talking about a story or a narrative, simplex is the surface of the story. Complex is below the surface of the story, and multiplex is multiple dimensions of the story. So here's an example of that. If you can see this, it's upside down only because the text identifying